In today's video, we are going to see how the high voltage towers were finally installed and wired up. We'll see how a maintenance building was added to the layout for Q&NE maintenance away vehicles. And we'll also take a look at the actual vehicles themselves. And since we'll be on the subject of vehicles, we'll take a look at new vehicles that have been added to the layout since the last full operating session. Here is a look at the completed setup of the high voltage tower system, beginning with the end connection at the substation. And you'll note that there are only 3 conductors, not 6, and that's because the substation is actually only set up for an incoming 3-wire conductor system. The spacing between the main towers is roughly prototypical. It works out to just under 300 feet. Most towers I've seen where there's 110,000 volts, it's around 450 feet, so it's not bad in terms of selective compression. I used the large diameter pole that comes with the kit to make a 90-degree turn in the alignment of the transmission lines. This allows the lines to kind of terminate at the far wall between the old, now out of service powerhouse and the automobile parts manufacturing plant. This is a convenient way of simulating how the transmission line originates somewhere beyond the layout. I know this is a little different from what we've discussed in previous videos in terms of the direction that this transmission line was going to take, but hopefully I'll be able to explain here how I arrived at the design you see here. Originally, I was considering having the transmission line come from the distance up above the tree line in the corner of the layout. This would have meant that I'd have to cut an opening in the forest for a clear path for the hydro corridor, because typically the hydro lines are not through wooded areas. At least a path is cut through for access and safety. Also, the scenery that I used to build that corner of the layout meant that I wouldn't be able to have a solid foundation to install the tower. Even though these are only models, there is quite a bit of tension in the wires once you install them, or there needs to be some tension in the wires in order to give it that look that of the wires hanging between the towers. And it just wouldn't be an easy way to have the tower off in the corner at the tree line to be standing up in such a way that it isn't pulled down by the wires. So I really had to drop that idea and look for an alternative at the same time. At the same time, I was experimenting with different arm configurations for the towers. Here you see a version that has the wires on either side of the tower, two wires on, or 2 arms on one side and the third arm on the other side. Didn't sit well with me because there was quite an angle of bend in the direction of the wires. It was here that I realized that it was kind of an obvious solution to have the transmission line pass nearby the now closed power plant. There must have been power lines in the area at some point in the past, so it kind of made sense to pass nearby it. At first, I had the 90-degree tower right next to the power plant building, but quickly realized that that actually wouldn't make a 90-degree bend, so I had to bring it further away from the power plant and introduce another tower along the wall. Here's another pole configuration that I played around with for a bit. In the end, didn't like it much either. So eventually landed on the one that I went with, which is simple. Sometimes simple is just better. Just 3 insulators along the pole. So here you see the final pole layout, temporarily placed. I stood back and stared at it for quite some time to make sure that it's what I wanted to go with. You'll see here at the power plant, the extra pole is just leaning against the building temporarily, but it's meant to go along the wall at the back of the power plant. With the concept nailed down, I proceeded to figure out how to actually install the poles into the plywood base and then string the wires between the poles and ultimately connect them to the substation. Working backwards from the theoretical beyond the layout connection, I had to find a way to get a pole as close as possible to the actual wall. This was a bit of a challenge because you need a 1/4-inch hole drilled into the plywood, and it's just not possible to get an electric drill right up to the wall to drill that hole. So you kind of have to go in at an angle. The plywood here is 3/4 of an inch thick, and so the closest I could get to it was about an inch away from the wall. Because of the angle of the hole that was drilled, I had to bend the pole base slightly. I did this by holding a flame under it till it softened slightly. And then I applied some gentle pressure just to bend it enough so that it slipped into the hole and stayed straight. Nevertheless, I needed a little help to stay perfectly straight, and so I punched in a small finishing nail to keep it aligned vertically. Fortunately, the base of the pole at this location is well hidden by the building, so you never know the nail is there. Although the poles come cast in a gray plastic, they do need to be painted, and I felt they needed to have a weathered look. So I used dry brushing techniques and 2 different tones of gray to simulate the look you see on these poles from the driving rain and wear and tear. I found it was best not to install the poles first and then attempt to wire them up later, but better to wire them as you go along. I also reamed out the holes in the insulators so that the wire would slip through it more easily. The wire that comes with the kit is actually not wire at all, but it's a thin gray rubber strip shaped like a wire. This gives you tremendous flexibility as to how taut you want the wires to be, or to let it have a little bit of sag. The kit comes with more than 30 feet of this rubber wire. I cut it into 4 strings of 8 feet each. I probably could have used 6 feet, but I didn't want to get caught short, so I have leftovers. I also painted the insulators, first with a touch of black, and then followed up with dry brushing of a white metallic, kind of like a pearl finish, to give it that glassy look. Starting with the first tower that will be along the wall behind the power plant, I threaded through the wires through each of the 3 holes and then tied knots. I followed that up with a dab of super glue on each insulator and then trimmed off the excess wire. There's a 4th wire that runs along the top of all the poles. This is called the lightning arrestor. This is not the same as a conductor wire, and so I wanted to give it a slightly different look than the rubber filaments that I was installing for conductors. To give it that finer cross-section, I decided to use regular thread. Well, not really regular thread. You can't use cotton because it's got a lot of fluff on it, so you have to use polyester thread. I tested gray and black to see which one I liked better, and I went with the gray. Here we see the first pole installed, and you can see the wires hanging loose attached to it. The wires are then strung through the next pole. In this case, it's the 90-degree bend. While it's on the table, it's easier to do that way. And then when you're ready, you put the next pole into the pre-drilled hole, and you pull the wires slowly, make sure you don't get any knots, to tighten them up. Some sag, of course, is left in the conductor wires, but the lightning arrestor wire is typically very taut. Once I was satisfied with the look and shape of the sag, I added a drop of glue at the end of each of the insulators to hold the wires in place. Once you've figured out how to do one pole, you simply repeat the process running from pole to pole. The trick is to remember to always keep some tension on the wires. Here you can see how I wrap them around some switches on the control panel. The trickiest part is making that final connection of the wires from the last pole to the substation. I used a clothespin to hold the lightning arrestor wire to the frame of the substation while the glue dried. The very last step is to decide whether or not to carry the same conductor wires down to the circuit breakers on the ground, or to use the same kind of conductor that I used elsewhere in the substation to run up from the circuit breakers to the wires above. Ultimately, I decided to use the same metal wire, the same gauge of black coated wire that's used elsewhere in the substation itself to connect the two ends. Here you can see how I used tweezers to hold the ends of these wires to the tips of the circuit breakers while the glue dried. And here are a couple of views of the finished substation area. Once the wiring was complete, I went back to the pole bases and filled the areas around it with some crushed limestone dust and some diluted white glue and water, and that set the poles firmly in place. If I ever need to move them, remove them, adjust them, all I need to do is soak them in water. Here's a little demonstration of the flexibility in the wires. This is good in case you bump them accidentally. Well, this kind of wraps things up for the substation transmission tower project. The one thing that I'll note here as a lesson learned, and maybe a follow-on project at some point in the future, is that the poles that are at bends in the wire or changes in direction of the wire typically have a stabilizer pole behind them to provide support against the pull of the wires in the direction of the angle. I haven't done that, but I'm showing you here where those poles could be placed at some point in the future. The lesson learned here is I should have drilled through the extra holes in the pole to allow for wires to be pulled through with a knot on the end to glue it in place. I'm going to have to try and hold the poles very steadily to drill through with a pin vise if I'm going to do it. As I hinted in the last video, the last open space on the layout is going to be filled with a vehicle maintenance area. And this will be for company vehicles, the Quebec and New England maintenance fleet. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the kit assembly. It's a very straightforward kit, easy to assemble, 4 walls and a roof, doors, bits of details, etc. What I will talk about is how I made the building unique to the Q&NE and what I did to the surrounding area that the building will sit in. And here you can see where I marked off the footprint of the building and how I squared away the facility's overall footprint by trimming away some of the grass that was laid some time ago. I was able to find the same color that I used on the Diesel Shop project that you may recall from a few videos back, but I found a flat version rather than the gloss version I used, so this helped quite a bit. It feels like the flat goes on a lot less thick than the gloss does. I did, however, pull out the old airbrush and gave some of the parts a coating of railbox yellow to provide some accents against what would otherwise be all red. Here you see one of the roll-up doors being clamped in place after applying a bit of glue. You can also see that I gave the building the same kind of treatment as the diesel shop, with a yellow stripe and a lower portion of the building black. And turning our attention now to the actual grounds of the facility, the driving surface, I applied the same crushed limestone dust that I used in the substation as well as in the propane gas facility elsewhere on the layout. I used a piece of scrap styrene, actually left over from the kit from one of the extra walls, to set the height of the crushed limestone so that it would match with the floor of the building once it's set in place. As I've mentioned before, applying this crushed limestone dust is just like laying ballast, but one of the tricks I like to use to give it a more flat driving surface is to use the roll of tape you see here and roll it back and forth like a steamroller would in laying asphalt as the mixture dries. And here we see a test fitting of the almost finished structure in the almost finished facility. To give this facility a little bit of a different flavor, I decided to use concrete barriers instead of a chain link fence. If you look closely, you'll see that I gave them a bit of a weathered look by giving them 2 coats of gray, kind of dry brushing them like I did the high tower poles. And here we see the completed facility, including some vehicles, which we'll talk about in a moment. I did run into the same problem with my aging decals for the Q&NE as I did with the diesel shop. They just don't have the flexibility they used to, and there are lots of cracks on it. So we're just going to have to assume that it's a little bit weather beaten and it's in need of a repainting. I was looking for a quick way to populate the maintenance way facility with some Q&NE vehicles. Quick and cheap way, I guess is more accurate. Eventually I'll have to look for some more detailed, perhaps 3D printed vehicles, but for now I was able to find 3 Trident vehicles and a Boley vehicle. The Trident crew van and the Boley more modern vehicle were already in a red color that was close enough to be used, but the step van and the older pickup truck needed to be repainted, so I gave them a quick coat of signal red with the airbrush. I also painted the rear portion of the Boley truck flat black to match the Trident pickup truck. Naturally, this required full disassembly of these vehicles, something that wasn't obvious at first. The Boley vehicle has screws, but the others do not, and they really need to be pried apart to pull the shells off the chassis. I don't know how, but the steering wheel from the older pickup truck came off or was loose, and there wasn't an obvious place for it to be repositioned, so I had to drill through the dashboard to reinsert it with a dab of glue. This older kit also came with the front grille and bumper unpainted, so I gave it a quick coat of aluminum for now until I can find a chrome type color. Fortunately, when I made my custom decals so many years ago, I think it's going on 12 years now, I included some very, very small logos for the nose of my locomotives, and these were just about the right size to be used on these vehicles as well. With one exception, of course. The oldest vehicle, the pickup truck, there wasn't enough width on the door and frame to have the lettering spelled out, the Quebec and New England, so I carefully trimmed it off with a sharp blade, and you just see the single letters Q&NE. The Boley truck rides high on its frame, prototypically so, but as a result you can see inside the wheel well, and the tan colored plastic was very distracting, so I just painted it black so it wouldn't reflect and show through. Here we see a group shot of the Q&E family of service vehicles, but we're still not finished. We have to install these side mirrors. And here are the final showroom photos assembled with the mirrors. Obviously they can do with a bit of weathering, but for now we're going to call it done. Here you see on the old pickup truck the front grille and bumper have been painted aluminum. And here we take a final look at the Boley truck. This was originally, at least it's called, a fire truck in their sales material, and the flashing lights on the roof kind of suggest it's for fire truck service. It also looks perhaps a little too modern for the era of my railroad. This part is removable, but there are two holes in the roof where the part fits in. I would have to replace this with two yellow flashing beacons if I can find the right size. That might make it look less like a fire truck and more like a maintenance vehicle. I've had these three tractors for an awful long time, and I remember getting them, I think, at Walmart. They were inexpensive, but they've always bugged me a little bit because they're too modern for my layout that's set in the late 1980s. They're very aerodynamic. So I finally decided it was time to go shopping for some replacement tractors. Here's what I got. 4 Kenworth 800Ws. These are without the sleepers, which make more sense in an industrial area like this layout. 4 different colors, 2 different blues, a white and a red. These are from Truck Stop Hobbies. I found a propane tank trailer made by Tonkin Models that's perfectly suited to serve the gas industry that I have in the layout. And I mated it up with a tractor from Brekina. It's a beautiful model of a Kenworth K100 Aerodyne cabover, something you don't see too often. Speaking of Brekina, here is a nicely detailed Peterbilt 359 and a GMC General. And to fill out the fleet for my bulk transloading facility for plastic pellets and cement, here are a couple of trucks and stuff, Kenworth W900Ls with sleepers. And speaking of bulk transport, we added one more liquid tank truck trailer to the fleet. And from Walthers we have a selection of smaller vehicles, the orange and white refrigerated truck on the left, and this UPS step van. They offer 2 different logos for this vehicle, one with the bow tie and one with the more modern swoosh. The bow tie is perfect for the 1980s. And finally, from Rapido, we have a tribute to my late father. He drove a taxi for 35 odd years, and the last car he owned was a red Chevy Impala. Here it is. And just in case you're a new visitor to the YouTube channel, here are some photos of the other trucks and trailers that have been in service for some time on the layout. Enjoy. Gotta love that hanging bumper. As always, thank you for watching. If you enjoy layout improvement videos, here are a few others that you may find interesting. If you're not already a subscriber, you can click on the logo on the top right-hand corner of your screen.